Hey church, welcome and thank you for worshiping with us. Wherever you're at, in your home, watching on your TV, your laptop, or your phone, you are a part of this family. And you can watch and listen to past messages by heading to mycornerstone.family. On our sermons page, you can view playlists and search for past messages and more. You can even listen to our content by subscribing to Cornerstone America's podcast, which you can find on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. I hope you enjoyed the message and thank you for being a part of the Cornerstone family. There was this stunt pilot who was selling rides on a single-engine airplane to make money. One day, he was in an argument with a pastor because he insisted on taking his wife along for no extra charge. He only wanted to pay for one person, but he wanted he and his wife to be able to ride along. You know how those pastors are, right? I mean, like, really. And the pastor, not wanting to miss out on making some money, said, "I'll take you both for the price of one, but if you make any kind of sound or noise or say anything during the flight, you pay for two. You're going to get double price." So the pilot proceeded quickly to load them onto the plane, got them going, and he did all kinds of maneuvers, even maneuvers that would make him nervous. Both passengers didn't say a word. Finally, exhausted, the pilot landed the plane. The pastor climbed out, and the pilot said, "Man, I made moves up there that frightened even me, yet you never said a word. You must have incredible self-control." The pastor thanked the pilot and said, "I must admit, there was at one point you almost had me." And the pilot said, "When was that?" He said, "When my wife fell out." All right, bad pastoral joke. We're wrapping up this series fresh off the vine, talking about self-control, what self-control he had, right? Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 and 23. It's kind of where we've been jumping off from. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law. So I find it very interesting, and maybe you do too, that nestled among the Spirit's produce here is this seemingly out-of-place characteristic of the fruit of the Spirit called self-control. Self-control. Now, in some ways, we might consider this maybe the most important of the fruit, or aspect of the fruit, because without self-control, you can't overcome the flesh and the sinful desires, the nature of the flesh, so that the true fruit of the Spirit can be on display. What's interesting is the word here for self-control means strength. It means one who holds himself in. Have you ever had to hold yourself in? Have you ever had that feeling where you had to hold something in? Stacy told me this is as far as I could go with this conversation about holding in. But nonetheless, it means to exercise self-control, to hold something in. To be self-controlled is not to live in the bondage to the desires and passions and appetites of our flesh. If you go like two screens here for me. Self-control is the freedom to say no to the desires and passions and appetites of the flesh. Here's the thing, our bodies are good servants, but they are terrible masters. And while self-control is a good translation of the Greek word, the problem with self-control, the word self-control, is it tends to lead us to think that we can do it all by ourselves. That self-control, our determination, our will, our own strength, that we can force ourselves, get ourselves to do those things that we are struggling to do, or to stop doing those things we're finding hard not to do. In Romans chapter 7, verse 18, Paul makes this real clear that we've got a problem here. He says, "I know that nothing good lives in me, that is in my sinful nature, for I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out." If you go to my next screen. Where are we? We're lost in here. All right, go back maybe. Try and find Romans chapter 7, verse 18 if you can. He says, "Nothing good lives in me, not in my sinful nature." He says, "I desire to do what is good, but I'm having troubles carrying it out." He said, "I want to do good, but I can't do it." There's no self-control there. And it's our sinful nature is wrecking havoc on our lives. And if that wasn't enough, we live in this world that bombards us with all kinds of bad things. This Daniel Angst, here we go. So Daniel Angst, very interesting, a secular article wrote this. He says, who's in charge here? I find this very interesting. He says life, I think he hit the nail on the head when it comes to our culture. Life in modern Western cultures is like living at a giant all-you-can-eat buffet. Sound about right? Offering more calories, more credit, more sex, more intoxicants, and just about anything else one could take to an excess, more than our forefathers had ever imagined probably, with more possibilities for pleasure and fewer rules and constraints than ever before. The happy few will be those who exercise self-control. Did you know that Paul was a preacher of self-control? He preached self-control. Acts chapter 24, verse 24 and 25, it says, after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith. Verse 25. Now, as he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. Interesting that Luke would write this down like this, that he had reasoned about righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. Funny, those three things Luke jots down as being kind of the summary of what he was preaching about. Righteousness, self-control, and judgment to come. Paul was a preacher of self-control. What's interesting is Felix had no self-control. Of course he's going to talk about that because he was out of control. He was committing murder. He was committing adultery. He was doing all kinds of things, greed. He lacked any kind of self-control. And Paul lays it out that he was teaching on self-control. Now, Felix was probably not any different than most of the much of the rest of the people in the Roman Empire. Scholars tell us that in ancient Rome, when they were disciplined and controlled, the nation was great. But when they started to move into a lack of self-control and sin and anything goes, that the nation declined. Self-indulgence became the way of life. Sounds a lot like America, actually. And so Paul was preaching to him self-control. The end of verse 25 says, Felix was afraid and answered, go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you. It scared him, what Paul was preaching. He said, go away for now. I don't know if he ever had a convenient time to have Paul come back and preach to him about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. When D.L. Moody was asked, the great evangelist of the last century was asked, of all the people you come in contact with, who gives you the most trouble? D.L. Moody answered by saying, D.L. Moody, I have the most trouble with myself. Isn't that the truth? Out of all the people we struggle with, the person who gives us the most trouble is ourselves. And if we could kick the person who's responsible for most of our troubles, we wouldn't be able to sit down for weeks. Interestingly enough, Richard Foster, in his book, Celebration of Discipline, put it like this, how we try to take self-control and do it in our own strength. He says, our ordinary method of dealing with ingrained sin is to launch a frontal attack. We rely on, and here's the key, we rely on our willpower and determination as if that was going to be enough to get it done. Because this is what we typically do as followers of Jesus. We rely on our willpower and determination. Whatever may be the issue for us, anger, fear, bitterness, gluttony, pride, lust, substance abuse, we determine never to do it again. We pray against it. We fight against it. We set our will against it, but the struggle is all in vain, and we find ourselves once again morally bankrupt. And the reason is because we're trying in our own strength and our own ability. Again, that word self-control kind of deceives us, even thinking that we can do it in our own strength, in our own ability, and we can't. So to be self-controlled is really to be spirit-controlled. To be self-controlled is really to be spirit-controlled. And we could define self-control as control of the self by the Spirit for the sake of the gospel. That self-control is really coming under the Spirit's control and allowing Him to give us the strength to do what we need to do. Self-control. Self-control. Let's take a quick self-control inventory before I get into the steps on how we grow and cultivate self-control in our lives. We struggle with self-control in a lot of areas. Let me just give you a few. The first one is uncontrolled lust. Man, this is something we struggle with in our culture. Not only does our flesh have a problem with it, but our culture has made it so easy to get a hold of uncontrolled lust. Then there's uncontrolled spending. We have this desire in ourselves, in our flesh, that we want more, we crave more. And then our culture plays into that, selling us everything they can. Because what will make us happy is just buying one more thing, right? Then there's uncontrolled ambition, right? To exceed, to be a success, to look successful in the eyes of others, to have more ambition, uncontrolled ambition. There's a lot of people in America that are just going whole hog after uncontrolled ambition, thinking that will bring happiness. And then there's uncontrolled drinking. We could put any kind of substance in there. We have a tendency to lean that way through our fallen nature, uncontrolled drinking, and then uncontrolled anger. The Bible talks that a fool gives full vent to his anger, where a wise man controls himself. In many ways, we're out of control. So how do we come under the Spirit's control? How do we cultivate self-control in our lives? Not through our own strength and our own power or determination, but by the Spirit's power. Let me give you a few ways. This is not an exhaustive list, and if we had more time, I would add a few other things to this. But the first, I think it's a good starting place. The first one is to look to Jesus. It begins with keeping our focus on Jesus. He is the author and the finisher of our faith. And so self-control comes when we're surrendering our life or have surrendered our life to Jesus. We've yielded it to him. I think Titus chapter 2, verses 11 is a good scripture to go to for this. He said, for the grace of God has appeared. So he's talking about Jesus here. For the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. And then in the next verse, he says, it teaches us, right? So we could say the grace of God teaches us, or Jesus teaches us, because he is the grace of God, to say no to ungodliness and to worldly passions, and to live self-controlled and upright and godly lives in this present age. You know, something happens when we yield ourselves to Jesus. His grace comes upon us, and he gives us the strength to say no. He teaches us, the grace of God, or Jesus teaches us to say no to ungodliness. And he also gives us the power to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives. Something happens in our life when we yield ourselves to Jesus. The second one is guard your gates. You look to Jesus, but you've got to guard your gates. And I love this word gates, and I've used it in the past, probably not recently, but I think if there's three gates that lead to our hearts. There's the eye gate, the mouth gate, and the ear gate. Three gates that lead to our heart. We've got to keep our heart, and our heart is influenced by what we let in, and the way we let it in is through one of these three gates, the eye gate, the ear gate, or the mouth gate. And maybe this is why Solomon wrote this, Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. He said, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Well, how do you guard your heart? By guarding your gate. You're careful about what you let your eyes look at. You're careful about what you let your ears hear. And you're careful about what you let your mouth speak. Because those are all gates to your heart that influence your heart. And Solomon wrote under the inspirational spirit, above all else, guard your heart, for everything we do flows from our heart. Many times we get ourselves into trouble because we were looking at the wrong things, or we were listening to the wrong things, or we were saying the wrong things. We weren't protecting the gate. Achan in the Old Testament got himself into trouble because of what he looked like. David got himself into trouble because he was looking at something he shouldn't have been looking at. Perhaps maybe he wrote this. Perhaps David wrote Psalm 101, verse 3, after he had been looking at Bathsheba, and then he sinned and committed adultery, committed murder. He said, I will set nothing wicked before my eyes. Maybe he learned that he needed to be careful about what he looked at. How many times has this gotten us in trouble? I will set nothing wicked before my eyes, that we start to look, we start to glance, we start to linger, and then it leads us down a path. Achan failed in the area of self-control. If you remember the story back in Joshua, Joshua was leading God's people. They were going into the promised land, and they were told to take nothing from the cities that they went through and fought against. It was to be left behind, is to be destroyed. Well, Achan had seen some of the stuff. He had taken it, and it had cost Israel a defeat at the city of Ai. In a battle they should have easily won, they lost. Joshua chapter 7, verse 21, Achan explains what had happened when God had led Joshua to the person who had committed the sin. Listen to what he says. He says, when I saw in the plunder a beautiful robe from Babylonia, 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold weighing 50 shekels, I coveted them and took them. This is what happened to him. He wasn't guarding 8859. Self-control. So, do we have it up there? Okay, we're good up there. We're just not good here. All right, we'll just play along with me. I'm just going to still point. When he saw it, notice that when he saw it, it led him down a road of coveting it. And then he took it. And it was against what God had said for him to do. And it took the whole nation of Israel, it led them to a place where they were defeated at Ai. And so it starts with guarding, looking to Jesus and guarding our gates. The message here is don't stop, don't look, don't listen, don't do it. I've got a great point I'm going to use in a message coming up. It's don't do anything stupid. That's great advice right there, guys. Listen, you got to write that down. That's like a life lesson for all. Don't do anything stupid. Third one, Build good boundaries. Build good boundaries, meaning we've got to learn to say no. Self-control, part of self-control is saying no. It's one of the keys to self-control is being able to say no. If we can't say no, then we're going to get plundered. Our lives are going to get plundered. Build good boundaries. It's very interesting in Proverbs back in Bible days that they considered, obviously, a healthy city had healthy walls. Any city that had broken down, neglected walls was not healthy, was open to attack, open to people coming in and taking over. It was not healthy. It was a disgrace. It was shameful not to have strong walls. So we need to build good boundaries. We need good walls. And the Bible likens in Proverbs 25, verse 28, says, a person without self-control is like a city with broken down walls. Meaning anybody, anything could come in and start wreaking havoc in your life. And this is part of building good boundaries, having good walls, being able to say no when we need to say no. If in a modern day and age, if we were writing this today, we would say something like a person without self-control is like a house with its doors and windows knocked out. Man, we are not safe. With our doors and windows knocked out, our homes and everything that we have in is not safe. If we can't say no, then our lives are in trouble. Can we say no? We become vulnerable. That's why Nehemiah, he wanted to go back and restore the walls of Jerusalem because he knew the city was vulnerable because the walls were down. And he wanted to go back and restore them and build them back up. Sometimes we need to say no. Can we say no? It's a hard word to say, but it's a key for self-control. You think about Samson, who lived a seriously out of control life. He is a portrait of destruction for all of us to learn from. One of Israel's judges, the Spirit of God was upon him and empowered him with strength to lead God's people for 20 years. And one of his primary jobs was to protect God's people from the Philistines. But instead of protecting them, he would go off and sleep with the Philistine prostitutes, giving away his secret, not only losing his hair, losing his strength, but in the end losing his life because he couldn't say no. How about King Saul, who was also out of control? A life that he was so bent on getting David, on killing David, that his life spun out of control. The Lord's anointed, or lay my hand upon him, for he is the anointed one. As King Saul was chasing, hey, all right. What else? What else we got this morning? Take it all. All right, so as King Saul is chasing after David, David has this opportunity to kill Saul. But yet he has the self-control and the wisdom to say no. His men are saying, go ahead, do it, just kill him now. He wants to kill you, beat him to the punch. And David could have done it. He said, the Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lay my hand on him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. He was willing to say no. How many times do we get ourselves into trouble because we don't say no? All right, let's go to my fourth point, stay busy. Now, this is one of the few times you will hear me say stay busy, because I think in our society we stay too busy. Really, we need to slow down. But here's one of the times I will say we need to make sure we do stay busy, because there's a link here with staying busy or having too much time on our hands getting us into trouble. Titus chapter 2, verse 4 and 5 said, then, Paul writing to Titus here, giving some advice, he said, then you can urge the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, and to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. So I think there is a link between self-control and a certain amount of busyness. And that some of the troubles they had back then were some people weren't busy enough, they had idle time and were causing problems. And so Paul was saying we need to stay busy, not too busy, but not be so lax that we have time to get ourselves into trouble. So there's a certain thing that comes along. These two, I think, go together to a certain degree, being busy and also having self-control. So we find ourselves, I don't know about you, I get myself into more trouble if I'm not busy enough. And that's what David did, didn't he? He got himself into trouble because he wasn't busy doing what he should be. Instead, he stayed home. Instead of going to war, he stayed home, and he got himself into trouble and shows a lack of self-control. 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1 says, in the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David sent Joab out with the king's men and the whole Israelite army, but David remained in Jerusalem. And if you read the rest of the chapter, you know, this is where he sees Bathsheba, and he commits adultery, and then commits murder, and gets in all kinds of trouble. Because he wasn't out doing what he should. Sometimes we need to stay busy. Even if it means serving somebody, going around and helping somebody out if we don't have enough to do. Stay busy. We have a tendency to get ourselves into trouble. And then the fifth one here is to pray. David was a man committed to prayer. And I'm not going to talk long about prayer here, but prayer is important. We need to pray about everything. But here's the interesting thing about David. David prayed. We have a lot of his prayers captured in the Psalms. But one thing that I don't see is him ever praying about his love life. Praying about marriage. And this is one of the areas that got him into some of the biggest trouble in his life. Prayer. Are we praying about it? Are we honestly going before God and just laying it all out? Have we taken it to God? Sometimes that becomes our last step instead of our first choice. Why does it sometimes become our last step instead of our first choice? I want to read you what Max Lucado said. This is from his book, When God Whispers Your Name. And I love this, what he wrote about self-control. He says this, I choose self-control. I am a spiritual being. After the body is dead, my spirit will soar. I refuse to let what will rot rule the eternal. I don't know about you, but I love that. I refuse to let what will rot rule the eternal. I choose self-control. I will be drunk only by joy. I will be impassioned only by my faith. I will be influenced only by God. I will be taught only by Christ. I choose self-control. And I think sometimes we tend to live right here. We're letting what will rot rule us instead of letting the eternal rule us. Self-control. Through God, we don't have to let that happen. So get ready to wrap up this series this morning. Let's go back to Galatians chapter 5, verse 23. It says, but the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. We've talked about each one of these. But how about this last phrase? Against such there is no law. Against such there is no law. You can't legislate these. You can't make somebody do this. You can't make somebody be kind or gentle. And likewise, there's no law that can stop us from being all this. There's nothing in this world that can stop us from growing in the fruit of the Spirit. The only thing that can stop us in this is us. Our selfishness and our sin.